Good day, I am Dr. Garcia, and I will be discussing the ethical aspects of research. So please take note, this is a bit of a long lecture as we are going to look at some historical milestones on the development of ethics. Now for this session, our goal is to discuss the important milestones in the history of medical research, enumerate the different international and local guidelines for research ethics, explain the pertinent principles of research ethics, and after the discussion, we assume that you will be able to create an appropriate informed consent form for your particular research and to formulate the ethical considerations parts of your research. Now, some recent ethical dilemmas have arisen. So in 2012 of January, Facebook altered comments, videos, pictures, and web links posted by friends on the social networks of around almost 700,000 users. Now, they randomly reduced either positive or negative emotional content, and they found that when positive content was reduced, users posted less positive content and more negative material. When negative content was reduced, members posted more positive material and less negative material. Although this made thousands of people more happy or sad, the dilemma here is that the participants were particularly not informed of this study. So, although they were working within Facebook's data use policy, the authors of this particular study did not inform the particular participants that they were going to be participating in this study. Another notable recent event is the TGN 1412 clinical trial, which explored the use of a novel antibody for the treatment of leukemia and rheumatoid arthritis. During its phase 1 of the clinical trial, 6 healthy volunteers were randomized to the drug and 2 were assigned to the placebo arm. Active infusion was 1 in 500 dose given to the monkeys, but unfortunately all 6 of those randomized to the drug developed cytokine storm. So 5 of them were hospitalized for 1 month, and one unfortunate participant was hospitalized for 3 months. Now, as doctors, we are guided by the Hippocratic Oath, particularly primum non nocere, which is first do no harm. There were no regulations regarding the ethical use. So basically, we had the Hippocratic Oath at first. Okay. And then later on, Thomas Percival in his 1803 Code of Medical Ethics, he described the use of experimental techniques on patients that should be done scrupulously and conscientiously, governed by sound reason. Now, there were no real, tangible or clear guidelines on human experimentation, just vague statements. So there was really nothing to guide us before. Which brings us to the question, why do we need ethical guidelines? So let's look at the timeline. So one notable event in our history, specifically here in the Philippines, was in 1906 when Dr. Richard Strong inoculated inmates of Bilibid prison with bubonic plague instead of cholera vaccine. Now, this was a mistake in which the government investigation found that the plague serum was probably substituted for a bottle of cholera serum. Strong laid low because, of course, he got depressed. 13 subjects died. But he resurfaced 6 years later for another study, this time on beriberi disease. Okay. Now, this particular event was very notable in that Dr. Strong was acquitted by U.S. authorities, no, despite having subjects that died. and this was later on used by Nazi defendants to justify their horrific research. Another notable event, probably you've heard of this, in 1932 to 1972, a study was done sponsored by the U.S. Department of Health called the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Now, it studied the effects of untreated syphilis in about 600 poor, illiterate African American men. 399 were infected with syphilis and 201 had no signs of infection. Now, they were followed for 40 years for tertiary syphilis, no? And the researchers withheld treatment for these patients even when penicillin was becoming widely available. On top of this, the subjects were not told that they were in an experiment, and they were never consented, actually, since they were never informed. They never consented to be in the study. Okay. Actually, most participants who attended the particular clinic for the trial, for the study, thought they were getting treatment for bad blood. So they had no idea it was for a syphilis study. Now in 1939 to 1945, probably know this from your history lessons, the various experiments done by Dr. Joseph Mengele in the concentration camps, in which they conducted very inhumane, severe experiments on the Jewish population. Well, children were injected with chemical surgeries that were brutal, unanesthetized, and amputations were done with prisoners with deformity. They even did sterility and shock treatments to female prisoners. No? So they really did a lot of inhumane things to the poor prisoners in the concentration camps, which became the basis for, as you know, some of the popular movies like your X-Men. Okay. Now, 1944 to 1980s, we have the U.S. radiation experiments, where the U.S. government sponsored secret research on the effects of radiation on human beings. Again, the subjects were not told that they were participating in these experiments, and they were even conducted on cancer patients, pregnant women, military personnel. These experiments included a wide array of studies, like feeding radioactive food to mentally disabled children or conscientious objectors, inserting radium rods into the noses of school children, deliberately releasing chemicals over some cities, measuring the health effects of fallout from nuclear bomb tests, even injecting pregnant women and babies with radioactive chemicals, amongst other things. Now, because of these atrocities or inhumane experiments, in 1947, the new Nuremberg Code for Research on human subjects is adopted. This was used in the Nuremberg trials in 1945 to 1946 to convict the Nazi scientists of their war crimes. Now, the Nuremberg Code stresses that the voluntary consent of human subjects is essential. And among the key principles, or the other key principles, include that research should be done for the good of society, that animal experiments should be done first before we go on to human experiments, every effort should be done to avoid unnecessary suffering, and that research should not be done if death and disability are likely. Risks. The risk that the participants should incur should be commensurate with the benefits of the research, and every effort should be done to protect the subjects against even the remote possibility of harm. Research should be conducted only by qualified personnel, and the subjects should be at liberty to discontinue the experiment at any time they wish. It also stressed that any study should be terminated if it becomes apparent that death or disability will occur. Okay, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations. Now, this is a very general document, but in particular, Article 5, as it relates to research ethics, states that no one shall be subjected to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Hence, no one shall be subjected without his free consent to any form of experimentation. Now, given these documents, so at least for a time, subject protection was ensured, but other notable ethical dilemmas came in when in 1953, with the onset of the discovery of the structure of the DNA by James Watson and Francis Crick, an ethical issue arose when it was discovered that they stole X-ray diffraction data, basically, or not really stole, but they secretly obtained it from the partner of this lady here, named Rosalind Franklin. So her partner was Maurice Wilkins. So apparently he gave the data to Watson and Crick. And then afterwards, Maurice Wilkins had the audacity to even fire Rosalind Franklin after selling the data to Watson and Crick. Hence, she was never recognized for discovering the structure of DNA. And unfortunately, she died at the age of 37 from ovarian cancer. So even if this particular fiasco was discovered, Nobel Prize could not be awarded posthumously. Okay, so again, like I said, no, for a time we were assured that subject participation in was safely carried out in experiments, but unfortunately, there were still some events, such as in 1956 to 1980, where a facility at the Willowbrook State School was built to study hepatitis. Okay, so what happened was Saul Krugman and John Gills and other researchers, they conducted experiments on hepatitis, particularly on mentally disabled children. So what they did was they intentionally infected these poor children with the disease and observed its natural progression. But mind you, the experiments were approved by the New York Department of Health. Okay, so another similar incident happened again in 1963 with the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital study. So these studies were undertaken again by the New York City's Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital to develop information on the nature of human transplant rejection. So this involved the injection of live liver cancer cells into patients who were hospitalized for various chronic debilitating diseases. Again, the patients were not told that they would receive cancer cells because, of course, they thought this would frighten the patients unnecessarily. So they did this without the consent, again, of their participants. So with all this, in 1964, Helsinki Declaration was developed. Okay? So this was issued by the World Medical Association in 1964 and is the fundamental document in the field of ethics, particularly in biomedical research, and has influenced the formulation of various legislations and codes of conduct. So this particular document has had several revisions, and the latest being in the one in 2013. Okay, so it encompasses a lot of aspects in biomedical research, including the review of biomedical and behavioral research, adding ethical considerations in the protocols, justifying the use of placebo, providing post-trial access to successful products, and includes guidelines for medical doctors conducting research. Okay. Another well-known ethical guideline was, this was generally not basically focused on research per se, but in 1966, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was adopted again also by the UN General Assembly. This particular document gave the Declaration of Helsinki legal as well as moral force, in that in Article 7 it states that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. In particular, no one shall be subjected without his free consent to any form of experimentation. Now, in line with this, developments in human rights and ethical research, in 1966, a doctor named Henry Beecher published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine exposing 22 unethical studies in biomedicine, which included the Tuskegee syphilis study and the Willowbrook hepatitis study. Now, this particular article from Henry Beecher pioneered the discussion of ethics in clinical research, leading eventually to its publication actually in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, according to him, the studies showed a pattern of posing serious risks to subjects without anticipated proportional benefit. He claimed that the problem was not that the researchers were particularly malicious or evil, but that the problem was that they manifested thoughtlessness or carelessness, and he called for more rigorous self-scrutiny rather than public review. Now, although this is a good point to make, but he focused more on the responsibility or the centralness of the investigator in maintaining research. So there has been some debate about his thoughts in that we really cannot expect all investigators to be conscientious on their own. So we really need ethical guidelines. Now, in 1979, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research released the Belmont Report, which were the principles of ethical research on human subjects. Now, this became another key document in human research ethics regulations, particularly in the US. And this particular report focused on three essential principles, which is the respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. First principle is the respect for persons. It incorporates at least two ethical convictions. First, that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, and second, that persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. The next principle is the principle of beneficence, which is we should always focus on not doing harm to our subjects, and that we should always look at the benefits and the risks, and that the benefits should always outweigh the risks, or at least we maximize the possible benefits and minimize possible harms or risks to the patient. Next principle is the principle of justice, which is the basis for which burdens and benefits should be distributed. So basically, it's fairness in distribution and what is deserved by each of the research subjects. So it also encompasses the selection of research subjects, which needs to be carefully scrutinized, and that development of devices, therapies should not provide advantages only to those who can afford them. So there's also this subsequent principle or value of equity in this particular ethical principle. Now, how are these principles applied? So, of course, we have informed consent, okay, which values information, meaning we should inform the subjects of all aspects of the study. comprehension, in that informed consent should be easily comprehensible to all readers. So it should be in a language that the participants are ready to understand, okay, or they easily understand. And of course, voluntariness. So all subjects should be joining voluntarily. So there should be no coercion or force, coercion or force in their giving their consent. Okay. Also, there should be a systematic assessment of the risks and benefits of each study and a proper and rigid process for the selection of the subjects. Now, years after the Belmont report came out, in 1989, another fiasco by the Pons and Fleischmann partnership came about. Okay, so uh, you have two guys here, Stanley Pons and Martin Fleischmann, who held a press conference at the University of Utah announcing that they discovered a way to produce nuclear fusion at room temperatures. Wow. Now, however, after closer scrutiny of their experiments and their data, dozens of labs across the world reported that they could not reproduce their results. So they were accused of fraud, sloppiness, and self-deception. Now, another interesting case here was in 1995 in the case of Boots Pharma versus Betty Dong. Now, Boots Pharmaceuticals were basically going to sell this drug called Synthroid, which is a drug for the treatment of hypothyroidism. Okay, but in this particular case, they were trying to pressure Betty Dong to withdraw a paper from JAMA publication because according to her data, the drug Synthroid was not any more effective from the generic equivalent. So basically, they were pressuring her to withdraw so that they could market their drug as the best. Okay. So another notable event in 1997 was the HIV studies, which involved Peter Lurie and Sidney Wolfe, in which they published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine where they accused the NIH, the WHO, and the UN and the CDC of designing unethical studies on the prevention of HIV transmission from mother to child in developing countries. Now, this particular dispute spurred a debate or a re-examination on international research ethics codes. Then another notable event in 1996 to 1999 was a case of Apotex versus Nancy Oliveri regarding the drug defereprone. Okay, so basically, Miss Oliveri found, or Dr. Nancy Oliveri found that defereprone in a clinical trial at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto was showing unexpected risk of development of hepatic fibrosis. So what happened was Apotex terminated the trials and issued warnings for Oliveri not to publish or not to divulge her findings. But Dr. Oliveri published in 1998 in the New England Journal of Medicine. So what Apotex did, as revenge, they forced the hospital to dismiss Dr. Oliveri as the director of the hospital in exchange for more funding. So it's very unethical. Okay. And again, in 2010, so one of the more recent events, no? Apparently, the U.S. government paid sexual workers who had STD to have sex with soldiers, prisoners, and mental patients. Okay, so it involved 5,500 people in Guatemala. Okay, so the research again occurred without the knowledge or permission of the Guatemala government. So again, no consent there. So with all those historical milestones, all those events, all those cases, let's now go into what is ethics. No? So with all the learnings from the past, let's go how to prevent them for future research. So ethics is like the golden rule. It is also like the Hippocratic Oath or a code of professional conduct, and sort of like a religious creed like the Ten Commandments. Okay, so it serves as a guide, or these are norms for conduct that distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable behavior, like the first three documents, okay, that we mentioned. So these ethics are basically meant to guide people towards doing what is right, not just for the general population, but also for the participants, specifically in research. No? Uh, Now, all people recognize common ethical norms, but yet different individuals may interpret, apply, and balance these norms in different ways in light of their own values and life experiences. Okay, so despite differences in interpretation, we have international instruments and guidelines, okay, that hold true for most, if not all, countries. Okay, so first we have the Declaration of Helsinki, of course, and then we have the International Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical Research Involving Human Subjects by SIOMS. And then this, you will be familiar with this later on, which is the International Conference on Harmonization, Good Clinical Practice, or the ICHGCP. Of course, we have WHO guidelines also for ethics committees that review biomedical research. So these particular guidelines would encompass all research institutions. No? Other instruments and guidelines are the International Guidelines for Ethical Review of Epidemiological Studies and its evolution, okay, which was in 1993, which is Guidelines for Biomedical Research Involving Human Subjects, which was brought about by the outbreak of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which basically propelled large-scale trials for vaccines and drugs, okay, for this particular condition. Now, we do have relevant regulations also from some or most sponsor countries, which is the US Common Federal Rule and the European Union Common Directive. Okay? But let's not forget, we also have our local guidelines and our local governing agencies. So these are the key agencies for research here in the Philippines. First, we have the Philippine Health Research Ethics Board, or FREB, the Philippine Council for Health Research and Development, National Ethics Committee, okay, and we have the TOST. Okay. We also have local legislation supporting research, such as RA 10532, okay, which is an act institutionalizing the Philippine National Health Research System. So this is another governing body which is in charge of regulating and issuing guidelines on research. Okay, this in particular was developed, which is a national ethical guidelines for health research by the Philippine Health Research Ethics Board. So the latest being the 2022 edition. Okay, so with all these guidelines, with these agencies, how do we really ensure that these ethical guidelines are enforced? So actually, all research, especially those involving human participants, should undergo ethics review as per the DOST memorandum in 2007, which states the requirements for review of all health researches involving human participants, and which is further supported by the joint memorandum by DOST, DOH, CHED, and UP Manila, which states that all health researches involving human subjects should undergo ethical review and clearance before implementation. So before you do any studies on humans, human participants in particular, you really have to seek uh, clearance and approval by an ethical governing body. Okay. Now, for specific researches such as your drug research, we have the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, governing or overseeing all protocols, all researches or studies. They have the memorandum the DOH has the memorandum AO47A series 2001, which are the rules and regulations on the registration, including approval and conduct of clinical trials, specifically for drug research. And we also have the ethical guidelines for clinical trials on drugs, devices, and diagnostics. Okay. Now, if you're looking into genetics research, the governing body is the PCHRD, and they also have an ethical guidance for genetic research with a special section on stem cell research. Okay. Now, other circulars of note, or for other researches not encompassed by the previous documents, we have FDA 2012-008, which states the process for filing of application for medical devices. Okay. We also have 2013-004 for authorized drug products, and 2013-018, which is the adoption of safety and efficacy guidelines for the conduct of research. Now, aside from the guidelines, okay, we also have national legislation or laws that could probably affect the conduct of research. So we have RA 06809, an act lowering the age of majority from 21 to 18. So this could be relevant when you are doing pediatric research, specifically because for minors, you need the consent of their parents. Okay, we also have RA 08423, which is a Traditional and Alternative Medicine Act. Okay, for those who are interested in looking into traditional and alternative medicine. RA 08485, which is the Animal Welfare Act. Specifically, this will uh, probably guide those who want to go into animal experimentation or animal research. Okay. 09711 would be the Food and Drug Administration Act. Okay, so for those doing research on drugs. And as mentioned earlier, RA 10532, which is the act institutionalizing the Philippine National Health Research System. Okay, so how do all these infrastructures work towards human protection and human research? Okay, or health research. So basically, they act as one to protect the participants. So the FDA, the FREB, research institutions, they act as guides or guards, okay, if you want. Okay, so they basically guide the researcher, the sponsor, and the ERC towards safeguarding the safety and the rights of the participants. Okay, so the evaluation of a research protocol by an ethics review committee that promotes safety and protection of the dignity of human participants is essential or crucial for any human health research. So we have in UERM the RIHS Ethics Review Committee, which is level 3 FREB accredited. Okay, and an ethics review is a systematic process by which an independent committee evaluates a study protocol to determine if it follows ethical and scientific standards for carrying out research on human participants. It should be compliant with the guidelines and help ensure the dignity, rights, safety, and well-being of research participants are promoted. Okay, so should also be compliant with the FERCAP and SIDSER guidelines. Okay. So for an ethics review, what basically are they looking into when you submit your protocol. So first, of course, they're going to review scientific design and conduct of the study. So most of your classes here in ResMed are geared towards that. So you can develop the appropriate design, you can develop the appropriate protocol or processes for your study. And more importantly, of course, the ethics panel or the review committee will look into your informed consent process, which brings us to our next section on informed consent. Okay. So what is informed consent? So basically, it's a process by which a subject voluntarily confirms their willingness to participate in a study. Okay. But they have to be informed of all aspects of the study, and the consent has to be documented, meaning it should be written, signed, and dated. Okay. Now, the informed consent process should encompass how participants are recruited, how they are cared for and protected, how their privacy and confidentiality is ensured. It should also state the risks, benefits, and the safety of participants in the study. And it should also take into consideration vulnerable populations and community considerations and provide post-research care. Okay? So all those should be noted in your informed consent. Okay? So when you get consent, you have to explain all those. Okay? In order to protect human subjects. So informed consent is really a long process, okay? And it should be sought from each prospective subject, or if the subject is unable to legally provide consent, it should be given by a legally authorized representative or a LAR. Okay? And again, it should be appropriately documented. What are the elements of an informed consent? Okay, so according to the ICHGCP, all these should be in your consent form. Okay, so it should state that the study involves research, that the participation is voluntary. It should involve information about the purpose, duration, and procedures, how many subjects are involved, what are the risks, benefits, and alternatives. What they should also provide information on how participants are compensated in case of injury or any uh, investigational product related injuries or illnesses. Okay? Any statement, and it should include a statement regarding confidentiality of records. Now, for possible unforeseen risks, there should be a brief description also in the informed consent, just so they know all the risks or possible risks. Okay? Other elements include the circumstances for termination without subject consent. So, for example, a subject is not seen for their scheduled visits for a particular study, or they are not cooperative. So there should also be statements there wherein you explain how they can be removed or terminated from the study even without their consent. Okay? Okay, they should also explain what are the consequences if they are withdrawn or they withdraw voluntarily from the study. Okay? Additional costs resulting from participation should also be explained. Examples of this are, for example, costs relating to transportation or loss of work, and especially for the days when they go to your study and they are unable to report to work. Okay, so those should be stated there. Now, you should also state that any new research findings should be shared with them, okay, after the study is done. And of course, you should always put contact information should they have any questions or concerns regarding the study. Okay. So, in coordination with consent, there's a principle called assent. Okay, so this one involves studies wherein minors are participants. Okay, so should be understood as the minor's will to participate in a clinical trial with legal value. So this is given by the minor themselves, and the minor is a person who is too young to give informed consent, but those that are old enough to understand the research, the risks and benefits, and the activities expected of them as subjects. Okay, so the assent by itself is not sufficient. Okay, so even if the child gives their assent, this does not automatically mean that you can enroll them in your study. Okay, of course, the subject's parents or guardians' consent is still required before they join the study. Okay, so in particular, the UERM-ERC requires the following. So as you can see, those under 7 years old, you do not get assent. Okay, because presumably they are still too young to understand. So how do you get them to join your study? You have to ask the parents' permission. Okay, so the parents' consent is the requirement. Now, for those 7 to 12 years old, a verbal assent may be given. And for those 12 to 15 years old, a simplified assent form may be filled up by the participant themselves. And then 15 to 18 years old, co-sign informed consent can be obtained. Okay, so why this particular age delineations? No, so this is actually based on a study done in 2014. Okay, so the critical age was the threshold was determined at age 5 to 7. Okay, so this is called the school age threshold. Okay, now another ethical principle which goes hand in hand with your informed consent is the concept of privacy. Okay, which in research is the assurance of the secrecy of the identity or information about research participants, which is always partnered with confidentiality. Okay, which is the duty of the healthcare providers and the researchers towards the patients to protect their privacy and to refrain from unauthorized disclosure of any information pertaining to them. Okay. So this is further stressed by RA 10173 or 10173, which is the Data Privacy Act of 2012, in which personal information, which is any information recorded in material form or not, from which the identity of an individual is apparent or can be reasonably and directly ascertained by the entity holding the information, okay, or when put together with other information could directly and certainly identify an individual, should be protected at all costs. So you cannot just release any participant's personal information to anyone. Okay. Now, sensitive personal information refers to personal information that concerns any of the following. So the race, ethnic origin, etc., an individual's health, education, genetic, or sexual life. So also any information issued by government agencies such as licenses, the current health records, and those information specifically established by an executive order or an act of Congress to be kept classified. Okay. Now, what is the penalty if you violate the Data Privacy Act? So, if it's an authorized processing of personal information, you may get imprisonment ranging from 1 year to 3 years and a fine of not less than 500,000 pesos to 2 million pesos. Whereas unauthorized processing of sensitive personal information would get you in prison for 3 to 6 years and a fine of not lower than 500,000 pesos to 4 million pesos. So, again, looking back, so personal information is anything that can identify a person, whereas sensitive personal information are those that are enumerated in the slide. So, be very careful when you divulge any data. Okay. Another important consideration when it comes to protecting our subjects are those that are considered as vulnerable populations. So these are women, children, prisoners, people of different race or color, those with cognitive impairment, those with social or economic disadvantage, those with inherent situational vulnerability, and those that are part of the indigenous population. Now, these populations require special protection because of certain characteristics that are innate to them. Okay? And these groups should not be included in research unless uh, the particular research or study is necessary to promote the health of the population represented. Okay? So for these particular populations, there just has to be certain specific processes or special considerations when you do research on these groups of people. Okay, now another, or I think the last principle when it comes to protecting human participants is the use of placebo. Okay, so when you do your experimental studies, the use of placebo should be scrutinized. Okay, so you only use placebo when when there are no proven prophylactic, diagnostic, or therapeutic method, okay, that can go against your experimental treatment. Okay. Now you have to weigh the benefits, risks, burdens, and effectiveness of the new method. Okay, and usually this should be tested against the best possible method out there. Okay. So only when there is no established effective intervention, or when withholding the established effective intervention would probably cause more harm to your subjects. So that's when you use the placebo. Okay. All right. So in particular, protection of your human participants, they are guided by the ICH-GCP guidelines. So which is why most researchers require, or most studies require, that researchers who are trained in these particular guidelines are those that can perform clinical trials. So if you want to do a clinical trial, you have to get this particular training, and it's valid for 3 years. In UERM, you can get it from the RIHS. Okay, there are also other trainings online. Okay, so they involve of course, studying the principles of the ethical guidelines, and then you are usually asked to do a post-test and a pre-test. Okay, so other principles in relation to ethics, okay, we have, of course, the negative side, which is research misconduct. Okay, so it involves fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. Okay, so fabrication is when you make up data or results and then you record or report them. Falsification is when you manipulate materials, equipment, processes, or you even change your data such that your research is not accurately represented. Okay? And of course, we all know plagiarism. Okay, so when we basically claim credit, or you claim something as your own. Okay? Now, research misconduct represents a significant departure from accepted practices, and they have been committed intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly, and is proven by a preponderance of evidence. Okay? So examples are when your research is written by ghostwriters through a template being sold for $8,000 to $10,000, or sometimes it happens when there is a need to publish simply for promotion. Okay? So research for promotion and not for research sake. Okay? So David Goldstein in particular shared that some reasons for fraud. Okay? So in which the perpetrators were in all cases under career pressure, knew or thought they knew what the answer would turn out to be, even if they went to all the trouble of doing the work properly, or they were working in a field where individual experiments are not expected to be precisely reproducible. So these are possible areas of fraud. Okay. Another area is when you don't ask permission to use data. So remember that you need permission to use data when the information uh, is contained in libraries, databases, and archives. Okay, so you need permission for those. When the information is posted on some websites. Okay, so when it's already posted, you need permission. You have to ask the authors. Okay, so this one, the next one in particular, might concern a lot of you when you use data collection tools or research instruments from other articles. Okay, so what you do, you need to ask permission from the original author, especially if they created the tool from scratch. Okay, so when you use published photographs and other published information, and when you use copyrighted or patented processes or materials. Okay? So how do you ask permission? For example, if you want to use a particular survey tool or survey form, simply write the author. Okay? Usually they put their information where you can write them. Okay. Another concept that we should be talking about when it comes to ethics is the concept of deception, which is providing false information to the participant about the nature and or purpose of the study. So basically, you're lying to the participant. Okay? But take note, it is discouraged but not necessarily disallowed. Okay? Sometimes it is required to conduct a valid research study, but you must justify the use of the deception. Okay, so here are some cases. So types of deception include deception by omission, which is withholding facts from the participants. Okay? Example, subjects are asked to take a quiz, but they are not told that the research question involves a background noise. Okay? So you ask them to take a quiz, you create an environment where they have background noise. Okay, so basically you were studying how this affects their ability to concentrate or to take the quiz or answer it correctly. Okay, or in a case where participants are asked to read a list of words or view a series of images but are not told that their memory will be tested. In these particular instances, not telling the patient is actually beneficial for your study because if you told them that you would be doing these things because you want to check how the background noise affects their ability to concentrate or that their memory will be tested, their answers might be biased. So your research findings might be skewed or they might be invalid. Okay, but take note that in these instances, the safety of the participant is not compromised in any way. Okay, of course, you do not do deception by omission if the participant is harmed in any way. Okay. Next, we have deception also by commission. So you lie or purposely mislead research participants. Okay. So in the first one, you basically just didn't tell them some things, but in this one, you purposely lie to them. Okay. So an example is when subjects again complete a quiz and are falsely told that they did very poorly regardless of their actual performance. You might be studying how they react to bad news, for example. Okay. Or a researcher wanting to study how people respond to negative health feedback may deceive participants by telling them a saliva test they took indicates that they may have a disease, when in fact the test was only a manipulation used to create an emotional response. Take note that in the first instance, there may not be substantial harm done on the participant, whereas on the other one, okay, this is a bit health related, so there might be other aspects of harm involved in the patient. Okay, so in this case, deception by commission is basically a bit more, in a way, a bit more harsh than omission, no? Because you're basically doing something, okay, to mislead the research participants. Okay, so how do we prevent harm in these instances? Okay, so what you can do is either you debrief, dehoax, or desensitize the patient. So when you do a debriefing, it is basically an interview with the research participant, which provides the opportunity for you to reveal the deception that you did. Okay, and for you to ask the participants if they have any questions about the study. Okay, when you dehoax them, you just basically inform them about the deceptive aspects, so there's no discussion there. And desensitization involves eliminating any stress or other undesirable feelings the study may have created. Take note that these actions are done towards the end of the study, and these are very important to prevent possible harm from what you did to the patient. Okay? Right. So another important issue in ethics is authorship and publication. So remember Rosalind Franklin, right? So authorship, it includes anyone who was involved in any area of the research, whether it's in the conception and design, the data collection, the drafting of the publication, right? And signing a certificate of responsibility. Okay. Now, in establishing authorship of any publication or any research, there are certain practices that should be avoided. So one is honorary authorship, wherein you put the name of somebody who wasn't directly involved in the study. Okay, we'll discuss more on that later. We have salami publication. So this is when parts of a data of a certain publication is used for a different paper, for example. So basically, they're deriving data from this particular study, okay? And then they're using it for their own research, okay? So this is discouraged, especially if you do not credit the original publication. Of course, duplicate publication is as the term states, okay, duplicating any publication and claiming it as your own, or premature public statements. So these are when you prematurely claim certain results. Okay, so that could be harmful. Now let's go to honorary authorship in particular. So there is quite a bit of a debate here whether it's a form of misconduct. Okay, so this is basically the practice of listing undeserving authors. So this is widely condemned, okay? And actually considered by some as a form of research misconduct, okay? Basically, they should not be listed, okay? Any person should not be listed if if these are the only contributions they made. Like for example, they are the chair or the head of a program in which the research was conducted. Okay, so for example, I did the research and then Dr. Wangko, our chair, approaches me just asking me to put his name, even if he did not work on that particular research. Okay, so that's honorary authorship. Okay, if they just provided funding for the research, okay, or they are the leading researcher in the area, or they just provided reagents or supplies, or they served as a mentor to the primary author. Okay, so again, there's a bit of a debate on this because some would claim that basically, like for Filipinos, there's this concept of utang na loob. Okay, but you should be guided that you should always give credit to where credit is due. So if they didn't do anything, why put them there? Okay, but still, it's up to you. Okay, now we look at how do you form your ethical considerations portion in your research. Okay, so how do we apply all these principles into practice now? Okay, so this is a checklist for your ethical considerations write-up. Okay, so first is your regulatory and ethical compliance statement. Okay, so basically you explain there that your protocol was approved by the local ethics review, was reviewed, and they stated the following corrections, etc. Okay, and then you applied it. So those are part of your ethical considerations write-up. Next, how do you presume to protect the privacy and confidentiality of your respondents? So you put your statement there. Next, and more very important, is how do you plan to get the informed consent or assent of your patient? So the process should be stated there. Okay. And finally, you should also put there the risks. Okay. Okay. So part of those part of that subsection for risk involves how do you plan to manage adverse reactions? When do you plan to terminate the study, for example? Okay. So for example, if you see that there are so and so number of reactions, you will basically propose to terminate the study at that point. Okay. You should also put there the guarantees of medical care or proper referral if needed, alternative treatments, the level of risk, of course, that would be incurred by your participants, and that the study is voluntary with the option of withdrawal. Okay. Now, here are some sample ethical considerations. So again, so there in the table of contents of this particular research, it was stated there. Okay. So this is an example of a statement for privacy and confidentiality. Okay, I will not read it out loud. You may pause the video if you want to read it. Okay. Regulatory and ethical compliance. So as stated there, okay, so you state the various regulatory standards that you had to comply with, how did you get approval, or etc. Or any or you can even put there a description, such as here on the last bullet point, no, of the particular ethics review committee that you applied for approval. Okay. Here is an example of the informed consent procedures. Okay. So there, you may pause if you want to read it more carefully. So basically, you're stating there how eligible subjects will be identified, that you will ensure that the participants adequately understand and that they will sign and date the forms accordingly, okay, etc. Okay. So now we go to the more practical aspect. Okay, so how do you apply for an ethics review of your study? So for our particular ethics review committee here in UERM, they have already come up with various forms that you just need to fill out when you are applying for review of your study. So these are as stated here. So how do you get them? You go to uerm.edu.ph. Okay, you go to the academics portion and look for research. Okay, I think the layout has changed a bit. Okay, so when you go to uerm.edu.ph, you have to click academics, and then you go to look for research, and then a page similar to this on the screen will come out. Okay, from there you look for the downloadable forms. Okay, a section, and there you will find the links, okay, for the various forms that you will need for your approval. So this is the lower portion. Okay, so when you click on those links, automatically the form will download. Okay, so these are all in Word format. So the first form you need is the review checklist ERC form 2B. So basically, you just fill this up and you submit this. Okay, so the check boxes there will be ticked by the ERC Secretariat, who will be checking your initial submission. Okay, take note that all ERC forms are in Word format. So when you submit them, you need not print it out. Okay, you basically just email it to the ethics review committee. Okay, the full procedure is, I think, still posted outside their office. Okay, so there's a flow chart there. Okay, so basically you just fill this up in Word format and you email it in Word format also. Please do not save it in PDF form. Okay, next is the ERC Form 2C registration and application form. So basically you just follow the form. Okay, it specifies what needs to be filled out. Please take note that there are some areas here that you are not going to fill out. Okay, and then there are tick boxes. You just need to tick the appropriate response for some of the questions. Okay, next is ERC Form 2D Study Protocol Assessment Form. Okay, so again, fill up the appropriate boxes, tick whatever needs to be ticked. Okay, just fill out the form as instructed. So basically, there are instructions in each form. Okay, this is ERC Form 2E for those of you who are going to use human participants in your study, the informed consent assessment form. Okay, so basically they will use this form to check your informed consent forms for appropriateness and completeness. And lastly, you have the protocol approval form. Okay, so you fill this up as needed. Okay, alright, so we've come to the end of this lecture. So in summary, let's all remember that medical research is meant to improve the quality of life for all. So not just the intended population, but also the participants. Okay. Now, in doing medical research, ethics has provided us reasonable boundaries to safeguard human rights. Okay, while ensuring that, of course, important research can be conducted. Subject safety and rights should be paramount in any research, and compliance to existing guidelines is important to ensuring humane research practices. So for the references for this particular lecture, so it's kind of lengthy. We used a lot of materials for this, and then basically we combine them into one. So you can just review the slides. Okay, you don't need to read all of this. Okay, so it's very lengthy. I'd like to also acknowledge that most of this lecture came from Dr. Wangko's lecture slides from 2022, and I included some of Dr. Quinones' slides from her informed consent lecture and her PPS lecture on ethics in pediatrics. Thank you for your kind attention. And if you're still awake, here's some chismes. Okay, some infamous medical scientists from the past. Okay, this guy you probably have heard of. The guy who basically spearheaded the anti-vaxxer movement when he first published his paper linking autism to MMR vaccine in the well-known journal Lancet in 1998. Okay, so basically, because of him, vaccination rates plummeted. Okay, so he was essentially stripped of his license, and Lancet even published a retraction of his paper. Okay. Another notable scientist is Dr. Haruko Obokota. Okay, she made headlines in 2014 when she basically reported a simple yet revolutionary method to create stem cells. Okay, so he co-authored this with a biologist named Yoshiki Sasai, and they both worked for the prestigious Riken Center for Developmental Biology in Kobe, Japan. Okay, so she published this paper in the Nature journal. Okay, so basically she got famous for this, but then reports began emerging criticizing the irreproducibility of her work. So sounds familiar? So basically, this prompted an internal investigation by Riken, and they concluded there was evidence to support scientific misconduct in her study. And last but not the least, Dr. Wang Woo-suk. Okay, so he was once a prominent figure in Korea in the international biomedical community after he successfully introduced Snoopy, the first dog clone to the world. Okay, so in 2004, he put himself in the limelight when he declared his team had successfully derived pluripotent embryonic stem cells from a cloned human embryo. Okay, so following year, 2005, he published another paper in Science, the journal, which demonstrated the establishment of 11 human embryonic stem cell lines from patient skin cells. However, there were allegations that women who worked in his laboratory donated their own eggs for the experiment. So what happened was his American collaborator, Dr. Gerald Shatton, withdrew from the research team because of the ethical violation from which the eggs were obtained. So an investigation was done by Seoul National University, and they concluded that there was deliberate fabrication in the 2005 science paper, and it could not be an error from a simple mistake. So very sad. So because of that simple act, all his work was undone. Okay, so that's my last slide. I hope you learned a lot today. So thank you again for your kind attention.